Okay, so are there good enough worlds? And if so, is the actual world a good enough world? Is it necessarily the case that God created a good enough world? And that's a somewhat tricky question. So, what do we mean by good enough worlds? Suppose the question is whether or not there is a set of possible worlds, call it S, such that they all have some overall value that is sufficient in some sense for calling them good enough. Assume further that the value of a possible world is in some rough sense quantifiable, so that we can state that there is some numerical value n such that for every possible world W that is element of S, it holds that W's overall value at least equals n. Suppose further that it is possible for God to create significantly free essences, and that is, essences endowed with contra-causal free will. Now, let us further suppose that there are two senses in which God can bring about certain states of affairs by strong and or weak actualization. Let's take the definition from Plantinga himself. A state of affairs S is weakly actualized by A if and only if A strongly actualizes a state of affairs S star that counterfactually implies S, and that is, were S star to obtain, that S would obtain. In other words, A could weakly actualize any state of affairs S if and only if there is a state of affairs S star such that it is within A's power to strongly actualize S star, and if A were to strongly actualize S star, then S would be actual. Notice that on this account, strong and weak actualization are not mutually exclusive, meaning that whatever is strongly actualized is also weakly actualized, and epistemically speaking, whatever is weakly actualized is possibly, yet not necessarily, strongly actualized. For suppose in the actual world God first creates the sun, and after that he creates earth, then surely it holds true for the actual world that God strongly actualized the state of having created the sun, call it S star, and counterfactually, the actuality of S star implies S, the actuality of the creation of the sun as well as earth. The key here is that the following condition holds true for the actual world. If God were to create the sun, he would create earth. Also, we can articulate a definition of weak actualization as follows, following Almeida. Suppose there's a possible significantly free essence E, a possible world Wn, and let T abbreviate some strongly actualized state of affairs. Then, if God strongly actualizes the state of affairs T, including the instantiation En of essence E such that, possibly, God strongly actualizes T and En does not perform A, and God strongly actualizes T and En performs action A, and God does not cause the state of affairs of En's performing A, then God weakly actualizes the state of affairs of En's performing A. This means that God strongly actualizes some circumstance T in which some essence E performs some action A. Though it's possible that, given T, E does not perform A, meaning there is a possible world in which God strongly actualizes T and E refrains from performing A. In the actual world, it's true that since God strongly actualized T, E does indeed perform A. But is this really an airtight definition of weak actualization? Not really, according to Almeida, since it is also true that, necessarily, God can strongly actualize the state of affairs T. That includes the state of affairs of God having predicted or prophesied that En will perform A. But if, necessarily, God can predict that En performs A, then it is true in every world that God can bring it about that En performs A without causing En to perform A. Suppose God predicts that tomorrow E will perform A, then since God is a perfect predictor, necessarily tomorrow E will perform A. But God does not cause E to perform A, he simply predicts it. And it's perfectly coherent that God predicts the actions of a set of free essences, all of which freely act in accordance with God's predictions. But then, surely God only weakly actualized E performing A, and yet the following holds. God strongly actualizes a state of affairs T, including the instantiation En of essence E, such that, necessarily, God strongly actualized T and En does perform A. God strongly actualizes T and En performs A, and God does not cause the state of affairs of En's performing A. And still God weakly actualizes the state of affairs of En's performing A. But then, WA is only a sufficient condition for weak actualization, not a definition. since necessarily it is within God's power to predict that every significantly free essence that he instantiates will always go right, or that the significantly free essences that he instantiates will together produce a world whose moral value is n or greater, we can return to our initial questions and deal with the question of good enough worlds. So, let S be a set of possible worlds whose value is n or greater. Call every element of S, so every world with a value of n or greater, good enough. Let Wn abbreviate the actual world. Now, additionally, suppose the following. 1. The actual world is not a good enough world, or Wn is not an element of S. Now, as we have stated, it is possible for God to predict that every significantly free essence in the actual world will always go right, from which it follows that the significantly free essences that he instantiates can possibly produce a world whose moral value is n or greater. And therefore, too, necessarily, God can actualize a good enough world. But now, since God is morally perfect, it seems obvious that, necessarily, God can actualize a good enough world only if God does actualize a good enough world. And from which it then follows, 4. Necessarily, God actualizes a good enough world. But 4 and 1 are contradictory. If we are committed to 5, God exists. But if we suppose that God exists and that a world is not a good enough world, then 2 has to be false, given that God is capable of predicting that each and all of these significantly free essences he can instantiate will not go wrong with respect to the actions they perform. It's hard to see how this could possibly be the case. But Almeida argues the following. If it's possible for God to actualize a world that is element of the set of good enough worlds S, then it follows necessarily that it's possible that God actualizes a world that is not an element of S. This implies the following absurdity. If, necessarily, the actual world Wn is an element of S, then possibly Wn is not a member of S, which implies that it's not possible that necessarily the actual world Wn is an element of S, which simply means that it's not necessary that God creates a good enough world. Or, as Almeida puts it, the impossibility-argument shows that it is necessary that God actualizes a member of S only if there is some world W such that the overall value of W is less than n and W is a member of S. But that's impossible since any world W whose overall value is less than n is such that W cannot be a member of S. The assumption that necessarily God actualizes some world in S entails a contradiction, so the assumption is false. Indeed, it is impossible that necessarily God actualizes a world in S. It is therefore impossible that necessarily God actualizes a good enough world. So how can one arrive at such a counterintuitive, seemingly muddled conclusion? Well, let us start abbreviate the set of all possible worlds of which S is a subset. Then 6. S includes all and only the worlds in S star whose overall value is n or greater for some positive n. Now, pick some world W0 whose value exactly equals n, and let W0 be a world filled with a set of significantly free essences that never go wrong with respect to any of their actions. But, of course, any and each and all of these essences could go wrong with respect to their free choices and actions. So suppose all the essences in W0 were to go wrong with respect to each of their actions, thereby actualizing a possible world W1, which surely is possible, and then it follows that 7. W0 is a possible world whose value exactly equals n. And 8. If W0 is a possible world, then there exists a possible world W1 whose value is less than n. So, by hypothesis, suppose that 9 holds. 9. Necessarily, God actualizes some possible world that is an element of S. 10. Every possible world is such that it is actualized by God. So necessarily, God only creates good enough worlds, and therefore from 9 and 10 it follows 11. Every possible world is an element of S. But here lies the rub. If W0 is a possible world, then so is W1. But W1 is not an element of S since its value is less than n. What does this mean? I mean that since W1 is a possible world, it is a world that is possibly actualized by God, but it's also a world whose value is less than n, and yet every possible world is supposed to be an element of S, meaning its value is at least n or greater. So by 7, 8, and 9, 12, W1 is an element of S. And yet by 6, 7, and 8, 13, W1 is not an element of S. So if 12 and 13 are contradictory, then our hypothesis is wrong, and therefore 14, possibly God actualizes some possible world that is not an element of S. But 14 surely contradicts 4. Necessarily, God actualizes a good enough world. But the question is, what did we actually do here? So let's take a closer look. If we have some actual world W0 filled with a set of significantly free essences, E, and a set of actions performed by the members of E, then the existence of that world implies the existence of some other world W1. For since these essences are endowed with countercausal free will, then for every choice some essence makes, and therefore some action A it performs, necessarily there is a possible world where that very essence performs B. Now, if all essences in W0 go right with respect to every choice and action they perform, then W1 will be a possible world that's axiologically inferior to W0. Now, let us remind ourselves of our axiological threshold n and place W0 right on n, then since W0 exists, there exists this possible world W1 outside of the set of good enough worlds. But if God can only actualize possible worlds, then only worlds above that threshold are possible worlds. And yet, since W0 is a possible world, W1 is a possible world. And yet it's beneath the threshold, which is contradictory. So it's not possible that it holds that God can only actualize possible worlds with a value equal or greater than n, since the premise implies its own falsehood.